Liberalism, the New Deal, Lecture 1. In the previous lectures in this part of the course, we have discussed the philosophic and intellectual foundations of American progressivism, tracing them back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Hegel in the 18th and 19th century in Europe. We also looked at the intellectual and philosophic foundations of American progressivism by looking at progressive political science and political philosophy in the late 19th and early 20th century. Then we moved on and we talked about the political vision and the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, who was the preeminent progressive president of the progressive era, though of course he was also preceded by Theodore Roosevelt. One thing I want to remind you of and to emphasize is the important statement that Woodrow Wilson makes in his New Freedom speeches, where he says, the old vision of government, where the government has as its primary purpose the prevention of harm, is too limited, and that under modern conditions, where changes in the economy have created new forms of inequality and a government that is run more or less by and for corrupt interests, the real goal of government should be reconceived in such a way as to empower the government to reconstruct social institutions in order to enhance the ability of average Americans or ordinary Americans to achieve a higher quality of life. Now, at this point, we move on to the man who is probably the most consequential liberal or progressive political leader in American history, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected president in 1932, was elected an unprecedented 4 times before dying in 1945. So he was president for a long time, from the early days of the Great Depression all the way through nearly the final days of World War II. Franklin Roosevelt was obviously a relative of Theodore Roosevelt, and when he was a young man, had been very impressed by, and I think it could even be argued sort of idolized his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, was very impressed by Theodore Roosevelt's vision of energetic executive leadership of the American government. And beyond that, he actually served in a cabinet post during the administration of Woodrow Wilson. So he had a direct link with the Wilson administration, even though the 1920s intervened between his time in the Wilson administration and his subsequent, 3 and a little bit terms as president. So the context for Franklin Roosevelt was the Great Depression. And this was a massive economic collapse. It created in the minds of a lot of Americans, especially a lot of the sort of the intellectual elite, the sense that markets had failed, that the extensive reliance on free markets had finally led the United States to a serious economic crisis. And the perceived failure of markets led to a renewed call for the building of a more active and expansive federal government needed to repair the destruction caused by irresponsible business practices and the like, and to provide more guidance to the economic life of the nation, both in order to prevent future crises, but also to become more actively involved in distributing material goods in a way that was meant to ensure a basic social safety net for all Americans. And of course, this growth in the scope and size of the national government is the major American constitutional and political development of the 20th century, and the New Deal was really at its heart. Even with all of the reformist policies that Woodrow Wilson promoted, it's nonetheless the case that aside from a few things, the federal government was not that different when Woodrow Wilson left office from when he came to office. But this is very much not the case with Franklin Roosevelt. Between when Franklin Roosevelt assumed office in the early months of 1933, and when he died in 1945, there was a massive change in the federal government. And so at the heart of constitutional changes in the 20th century is the New Deal. And at the heart of the New Deal is FDR himself, whose rhetorical national leadership as president persuaded a critical mass of American people to adapt or revise American political ideas in a way that led to the building of a federal welfare and regulatory state of a sort that had not existed in the United States before. And one of the things that I want to mention, because it doesn't necessarily come out in the readings that you do, I had you read selections from 4 speeches that Franklin Roosevelt gave. The Commonwealth Club Address, which is really his statement of principles. It was his signature speech of his first campaign for president in 1932. And it really lays out his vision. Then I had you read his first inaugural address with his very famous claim that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I also had you read the speech that he gave in 1936 when the Democratic Party renominated him as the Democratic Party candidate for president. And that's a very important speech in laying out his vision. And then finally, I had you read just a few parts of his 1944 State of the Union address, where he calls for a economic or a second Bill of Rights. So in other words, constitutional amendments that would commit the federal government to providing certain basic material necessities to all citizens, among other opportunities. So that's what I had you read. But one of the things that doesn't necessarily come out clearly in those speeches, and that I want to highlight here, is that Franklin Roosevelt, alongside changing the structure of the federal government through the New Deal and creating a welfare state and expanding the regulatory powers of the government, he also really fundamentally changed the office of the president itself in a few different ways. One of which is that, going all the way back to Theodore Roosevelt, remember, there was this claim that because the president is the only truly nationally elected politician, there's a way in which the president has a uniquely comprehensive view of America and America's needs, and that therefore it seems logical and right that the president ought to be, in a way, the leader of the federal government, since he has the most comprehensive vision. So there's this idea of the president as a kind of dynamic leader of public opinion, so that even though he doesn't have the power to legislate, he nonetheless, the president should use what Theodore Roosevelt called his bully pulpit to set the national agenda. And Franklin Roosevelt totally agreed with that and expanded it to new levels. Among other things, he took advantage of the new technology of the radio, or the relatively new technology of the radio, to basically bring himself into people's living rooms. So he would actually have what he called these fireside chats, where he would directly broadcast a speech to the American people. So that instead of the people, reading his speeches in a newspaper, they could actually sit down and listen to him in real time. And so he established a new kind of intimate communication between the president and the people. And he used that to try to mold public opinion in a way favorable to the New Deal. And so he made use of the media. He made use of rhetorical leadership. He was really an excellent orator to build up the office of the presidency. But he was also responsible for institutional transformations of the presidency. So it was really under Franklin Roosevelt that the president's personal staff of advisors and helpers in the White House became much, much, much larger. So at the White House, the West Wing, if you might have heard of that, of the White House, becomes a very politically consequential part of the American government. So Franklin Roosevelt was responsible for the reorganization of the office of the presidency in the late 1930s. And along with all of this, and in some ways, even though it is a little bit more intangible, say almost one of the most important transformations that he initiated, is that through his vigorous rhetorical leadership, he transformed, seemingly at this point permanently, the American people's expectations of what a president should be. as you might recall, in the 19th century, there were lots of presidents that really weren't much more than just chief executives. You wouldn't call them national leaders. Congress was really in the driver's seat, and presidents just ran the executive branch. Beginning with Theodore Roosevelt, even before then at times, really beginning with Theodore Roosevelt, you had this shift towards this notion that the president should be a kind of national leader. Franklin Roosevelt really perfected that role in such a way that the American people now expect presidents to be national leaders. So even though the Constitution doesn't actually give the president power to make policy, we expect our presidents to have a wide array of policy positions. We expect the president to have an agenda. If somebody ran for president today and somebody asked him, well, what is your education policy since you're a candidate for president? And if the candidate responded, well, I don't have an education policy. I mean, it's the job of Congress to make policy. I'm just there to execute it. So I'll do whatever Congress says, but I don't have a policy. If somebody campaigned that way, they would never win. It would seem irresponsible, even though from a constitutional perspective, technically it would be a correct answer, right? He doesn't have the power to implement policy, so why would he have one? But nonetheless, that's what we expect, and we expect that because of Franklin Roosevelt. And it creates this interesting paradox in American politics, which is that we expect a great deal from our presidents, and as a result, we are almost inevitably disappointed by them, in part because just constitutionally speaking, usually they are not able to achieve that much single-handedly. So unless, as was the case with Franklin Roosevelt, the president has a highly sympathetic Congress that he is able to control, which is also what Lyndon Johnson had in the early years of his presidency. Outside of those fairly rare circumstances where the president really, in his role as party leader, is able to control Congress, presidents just aren't able to achieve a whole lot unless Congress is willing to go along with it. And that's a major constraint. So we expect a lot from presidents. They campaign by making all sorts of promises, and they inevitably disappoint us. And that strange kind of cycle really begins with Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt's really the one that gives us that model of presidential leadership. So he expands the role of the president institutionally and as a national leader. He builds a larger federal government that has as its goals, among other things, much more extensive regulation of economic activity in the country, as well as provision of certain basic services, social security, welfare, and those sorts of things. And the other thing to add here is that this is all underpinned by a transformation in the understanding of rights. And this is the last point I want to make in this lecture. In the next lecture, I will get to his speeches. But in this lecture, I want to make a more general point. And here I'm going to use terminology that doesn't actually show up in your readings, but I think is kind of helpful. And you might have heard of this. Sometimes in a rough and ready way, political philosophers will divide up rights into two different kinds of categories called negative rights and positive rights. And the term negative rights, that's not a value judgment. That's not meant to imply that negative rights are bad rights or rights to do bad things. But a negative right means the right to be free from some form of interference or harm. That's what a negative right is, the right to be free from some kind of interference or harm. And when you categorize it that way, you could say that the natural rights endorsed by the founders were really negative rights. So, for example, the right to life, that's not a right that gives you anything. You are alive, right? That's just by nature you are alive. The right to life means you have a right to be free from your life being harmed. So you have a right to preserve yourself. You have a right to defend yourself, right? So the right to life, as the founders understood it, was a negative right. It was the right to be free from harm to your life. In the same way, the right to liberty was a negative right. So remember, the understanding is that by nature, we have a right to be our own masters and free from coercion or interference or oppression or domination at the hands of others. So the right to liberty really meant the right to be free from arbitrary control by other human beings. And in that sense, the founders' understanding of liberty is a negative right. It's the right not to be dominated or arbitrarily dominated. And again, the right to property, the natural right to property, was a negative right. For the founders, because you're free by nature, you had a right to the fruits of your labor. And really, the right to property, what it really means is you have the right to be secure in the property that you have acquired and to dispose of it as you see fit. And other people are not allowed to harm or degrade or steal your property or dictate to you how you use it. And so in that sense, the right to property, as the founders understood it, was a negative right. It was the right to be free from harm or interference in your use or enjoyment or disposal of your own acquired property. So the understanding of rights that lay within the Declaration and behind the founders' vision of government was a vision of negative rights. By nature, you are alive. By nature, you are free. By nature, you are able to acquire things rightfully in order to survive. And your rights to life, liberty, and property state that you are free from having those things harmed. And so the purpose of government was to prevent your life, liberty, and property from being harmed. Government doesn't give you life. Government doesn't give you liberty. Government doesn't give you property or the ability to acquire property. You have all of those things by nature. Government's there to make sure that other people don't harm those natural goods that you have. So that's the vision of rights for the founding. And one of the things that becomes clear if you look at it is that when you read the early progressive thinkers, when you read Charles Merriam, Frank Goodenough, and a number of others, and it's implicit also in Wilson and in some of Woodrow Wilson's earlier works when he was a political scientist, obviously the progressive intellectuals were quite hostile to this understanding of rights. I mean, it wasn't that they thought people didn't have a right to life or that people should be arbitrarily dominated, but they thought it was a too narrow conception of the human good. And of course, they also disagreed that we were free by nature. Freedom was something that had to be acquired. It had to be learned through a cultural and civilizational process. And they thought that the right to property was fundamentally artificial and therefore should be subject to greater social regulation. But more broadly, they thought that the founders' understanding of natural rights was one of the things that made the government, as the founders conceived of it, too narrow and individualistic in its scope, as though the entire purpose of government is simply to protect individuals from harm as they go about pursuing their own interests as they understand it. They thought that's too narrow a way of understanding what government is there for. So they were actually quite hostile to the language of individual rights. And if you read earlier progressive intellectuals, for the most part, that's not their ethical vocabulary. They will not talk in terms of natural rights. They will not talk so much in terms of individual rights because they think that's incorrect. It's the wrong way to think about individual duties and ethical obligations and the human good. But the thing is that put progressive intellectuals in a state of tension with sort of popular American political morality. You might almost say it's sort of in the DNA of Americans to think of politics in terms of individual rights. And however much the progressives rejected that way of thinking about things, it nonetheless remained a part of American thinking. And so this is one of those areas where it seemed like progressives were fighting a losing battle, trying to wean Americans off of thinking of politics in terms of individual rights. And this is where part of the genius of Franklin Roosevelt really comes in, because what Franklin Roosevelt does is instead of rejecting or ignoring the language of individual rights, he encourages Americans to reinterpret individual rights, to update their understanding of what their individual rights are. And to use, again, the jargon of political philosophy, the way he does this is by, in effect, arguing that we should replace negative rights with what are oftentimes referred to as positive rights. Again, this is not the language of Franklin Roosevelt, but it gets at the substance of what he's talking about. Remember, a negative right means a right to be free from harm or interference of some kind. A positive right means that you have a right to something, to some good or service. So a positive right is not a right to be free from harm, but a right to have or to enjoy something. And so What Franklin Roosevelt does is he encourages Americans to think of their individual rights as positive rights. So it's not so much that I have a right to be free from harm, but I have a right to an education. I have a right to a home. I have a right to a job. And when you reframe the understanding of rights in terms of positive rights, it necessarily leads to the question, if you have a right to this thing, who exactly is it who has a duty to provide it to you? Right? Because remember, with natural rights, the goods that are secured by natural rights are goods that you already possess by virtue of being a human being. Or you have life, you have liberty, you have property as a human being. But if you talk about something like a right to medical care, obviously you do not by nature possess medical care. If individuals have a right to medical care, that means there's somebody out there or some institution out there in society that has a duty to provide that health care to them. And obviously, for Franklin Roosevelt, that entity that is responsible for providing these things for people is ultimately the government. So when you reconceive individual rights in terms of positive rights, right to a job, right to a living wage, right to a home, right to an education, this creates corresponding duties on the part of government to make sure that those things are provided for everyone. And so the reason why this is such a fundamental shift is because earlier in American history, individual rights were some of the primary things that limited the expanse of government. It was individual rights that set limits to what government can do. I have a right to be free, so you can't tell me what to do. I have a right to my property, so you can't tell me what to do with my property. So individual rights were actually a limit upon the expansion of governmental powers. But when you reconceive of rights as positive rights, rights to certain goods and services, then the very language of individual rights becomes a spur to the expansion of the scope and responsibilities of government. So one of the things that allows Franklin Roosevelt to be so successful during the New Deal in building the American welfare state is this redefinition of rights as positive rights that teaches Americans to demand more of their government. And in this way, Franklin Roosevelt is able to marry the general welfare view of government, adopted by earlier progressives, to the individual rights political morality that has existed in America from the beginning. So in the next lecture, I will move on to his Commonwealth Club address, where we see in detail how he goes about presenting this new vision of individual rights and the purposes of government.